Welcome everyone, thanks so much for joining. We'll just wait another few moments for everyone to connect and then we'll get started right away. Good afternoon everyone, we'll get started shortly. We'll just wait another couple of moments for everyone to connect. But we'll start really soon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll wait another minute and then we get started shortly. So good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the Oxford Migration Studies Society, welcome to this 8th panel of the annual conference. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the co-presidents of OMSS together with Bella, who is behind the scenes this afternoon. And thank you so much for coming. We're slowly getting close to the end of this intense conference week. So well done, everyone, for making it until here and for bearing with us. I just wanted to take a few moments to flag some logistics before introducing the others on your screen. So we were initially meant to have 4 presenters today. However, unfortunately, one of the presenting teams is unavailable today, but their work is featured in a Reuters special issue. So please take a look at the article by Sarah Walker and Elena Giacomelli on the quarantine ship is floating hotspot. After the panelists present, there will be a Q&A session, and having 3 presentations will allow for real discussion at the end. So please feel free to type questions into the Q&A box as you think of them, with the name of whoever the question is directed to, if that's applicable. You'll also have the chance to upvote and comment on each other's questions. Now I'd like to introduce the chair, Biao Xiang. Biao is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oxford and director of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Germany. Xiang's research addresses various types of migration, internal and international, unskilled and highly skilled, emigration and return migration, and to places and people left behind in China, India, and other parts of Asia. Xiang is the winner of the 2008 Anthony Leeds Prize for his book Global Body Shopping and the 2012 William L. Holland Prize for his article Predatory Princess. His 2000 Chinese book, which has been published in English as Transcending Boundaries in 2005, was reprinted in 2018 as a contemporary classic, and Self is Method, co-authored with Wu Qi, was ranked the most impactful book 2020. His work has been translated into Japanese, French, Korean, Spanish, German, and Italian. And I will hand over to Biao now to introduce the panel. Thank you, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for the entire team behind this. When I listened to Sarah to announcing that we have 1 more minute to go, and then previously 2 more minutes to go, it really reminded me of the moment where airplanes are taking off. It's a very professional announcement, but announcement used to be so familiar to all of us as a mobile subjects, but it is no longer part of our life. I mean, for a while, but it will be again part of our life. So it is a touching moment for me to chair a panel at the Oxford Migration Studies Society annual conference in this way. As some of you know, I was involved in this degree from the very beginning, actually before the degree was born. There's a previous life to this degree. And then the society was formed, attached as a part of, attached to this degree. I can't remember the exact year, but I remember all these vivid discussions about how to organize the conference, to organize the society, and then organize annual conference. Then since then, I participated in the annual conference annually. I mean, unless I was away, but of course, this is the first time I join the conference virtually in the same way as you do. So I know how complicated the process must have been. So a big salute and thanks to the team behind this conference. I suppose most of you probably are from our MSc Migration Studies and the forced migration degree, and probably like Magda, who is now alumni to this degree. So it's a touching moment. I suppose this is also, but there's a good thing about the virtual conference because it will bring in many people from different parts of the world. I assume this will be kind of a mini reunion moment as well. Many alumni and will get in touch with each other and see each other or listen to each other's voices via Zoom. So, I mean, I hope I will see some of you later during the Q&A. I'm so pleased to see that now we have 81. So number keeps shooting up, the 81 participants. And I'm also very pleased to see that we have 3 very interesting and more importantly, timely and important topics to be discussed today, and by authors from different parts of the world with different disciplinary backgrounds. So I would like just to introduce our presenters in group now in the very beginning and to give you kind of landscape of our speakers. And then I won't repeat again when they start their presentation. Our first paper is jointly authored by Deanna and Maurice, but I understand that Deanna will be presenting today at the workshop. Deanna is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Brighton. Her research looks at the criminalization of social movements in Europe, including, of course, criminalization of migrant solidarity and housing struggles. So it's very interesting. She has a special interest in pedagogical issues, I suppose, how to teach migration to students. And her co-author, Maurice, is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Warwick. And his subject matter is comparative border studies at UC Davis. And I suppose it is primarily rooted in political science. So Maurice has a recent book published by Lottridge, Migrant Resistance in Contemporary Europe. And the second paper, I'm so pleased, by Ankit and Aishwarya. And I was worried for a few days because I understand that they may not be able to make it. I mean, I'm not sure it's correct or not, but I thought you were you exposed to COVID or you actually were infected by the virus. But it is great relief that now you have recovered, at least well enough to present your paper from the epicenter of the pandemic now in the world, India. So Ankit is, I think, a political scientist and studied in JNU and now is working, teaching in University Delhi. And we know these are two, probably not necessarily rivalry, but the two most prominent universities in Delhi. And Aishwarya is also a political scientist, studied in JNU Delhi and now is pursuing postgraduate studies in York University, Toronto, Canada. Last is a paper by Juan. Juan is an anthropologist, so the same discipline as I have been studying from the University of Granada. I don't know if you say Granada or Granada. But his own area of research is in the other side of the planet, working in Colombia, Venezuela, which is absolutely very topical issues, especially during COVID. So that is my brief introduction. And now may I invite Deanna to give your presentation.
Thank you, Biao, for your introduction. My name is Dadusc, and I'm going to present a paper that I wrote together with Maurice Stierl. The title of the paper is The COVID Excuse, EU Border Violence in the Mediterranean Sea. So this paper was written together with Maurice, but methodologically it draws on collective work and activist work that we've been doing with Watch the Med alarm phone. So the data that we discuss and that we analyze in the paper are actually collected by a network of activists who every day and every night picks up the phone and responds to distress calls from the Mediterranean Sea. The data that are presented and analyzed in this paper are collected not only by activists, but are actually produced by people on the move who call the alarm phone every day and every night, both when they are in distress at sea and when they need support for crossing, but also when they are on land. So when they are witnesses of pushbacks, when they are subject to pushbacks, when they survive shipwrecks, or when they witness all kinds of border violence. Increasingly, especially in the last year, people have been calling the alarm phone to document, report, and denounce the violence that we've been witnessing, and asking to hold authorities accountable for this violence. So this, for me, is very important because it puts at the center the epistemologies of people on the move themselves who transgress and resist borders, not only by attempting to cross borders despite all the restrictions and the violence of a border regime, but contest, transgress borders also by documenting and denouncing what's going on, and countering the hegemonic discourses around borders, as well as producing counter narratives that break the silence that, especially during the pandemic, has been forced upon the Mediterranean region. So increasingly, especially over the last year, people on the move have been the only actors who've been able to witness and document what was going on in the Mediterranean Sea, and it's only through their powerful voices that authorities were held accountable. Their voices were, and this counter narrative were produced from prisons, from detention centers. They were shared from hidden phones. And indeed, they become powerful weapons against the border regime that every year, and particularly over the last year, have been violating people's rights, have been killing or forcibly disappearing thousands of people, and that if it hasn't killed them, it has tortured them, it has imprisoned them, either in Libyan detention centers, in the case of the Central Mediterranean Sea, or for the people who managed to cross on quarantine ships, which of course are not the same thing, but they serve the same logic and are the result of the same racist politics, but of control, of surveillance, of confinement and segregation of Black and migrant lives. So our paper is focused particularly on the Central Med, and particularly on the borders between Libya, Italy, and Malta, and we've been looking at the effects of port closures under COVID. The paper is titled "The COVID Excuse," and the first time we submitted it to the ACME journal, it was rejected within 12 hours. It was a desk rejection, and I think it's because the editors thought that we were COVID deniers. So I want to clarify that talking about the COVID excuse, we do not intend to deny COVID, but we actually intend to analyze and explore how COVID-related restrictions have been used to expel, incarcerate people, to push back, to let them die with the excuse of public health, but regardless of actual public health concerns. So we analyze how increasingly COVID has been weaponized to normalize border violence, shifting anti-migrant rhetoric from portraying migrants as threats to public order to threats to public health. So in this context, the closure of ports by Italy and Malta particularly had a symbolic and performative function rather than an actual public health function, a performative function of state power that gave rise to what Heller addressed as sanitary apartheid. What is important for us is to address the COVID excuse not as an exception, but as a continuum. So although during COVID times and in 2020, with a border closure, the creation of quarantine ships, the withdrawal of rescue by authorities, we've seen an escalation and an acceleration of border violence. It is important to highlight that this is not an exception, but these practices are part of a continuum of organized violence at the border. Acknowledging this continuity is fundamental to counter dominant discourses that see these practices of letting die, of confinement, of containment, and of pushback as exceptional measures during exceptional times. It is important to acknowledge that these are not suspensions of a norm, but they are moments of amplification of a norm. So they are the result of practices that have been ongoing and that have been built for years, and that during COVID time, they find a moment of acceleration and a moment of amplification, but the grounds for these practices have been built through the past years. So what is new, however, is the way these practices are being legitimized and how letting people die at sea is legitimized as protecting people's lives, and particularly protecting white citizens, European citizens' lives. What is also new about the current situation, or about what's been happening since the beginning of the pandemic, it's been the increased invisibilization and silencing of this violence through increased attempts to shut down any critical gaze on the situation. So from the imprisonment of migrants after pushback, their containment on quarantine ships without access to phones, without access to the possibility to to even inform their relatives about their arrival, but as well to denounce the condition on quarantine ships or denounce the violence that have been subjected to during the journey, as well as imprisonment and disappearance of migrants after pushback, as well as through the increased seizure of rescue ships through forms of criminalization and administrative excuses to prevent the presence of civil society organizations at sea that would normally document border violence, would not only rescue people and prevent violence, but would also allow a system of documentation. So this invisibilization of border violence obviously seeks mostly to hide how this violence is systematically produced, how it is organized and chosen every day by EU member states and allies. So this violence is invisibilized and silenced, but through the attempts of resistance by people on the move who call the alarm phone and who denounce this violence, it is again rendered visible, and the conditions for accountability of authorities are created. The results, however, of this silencing, as Valia puts it, is to seek to effectively blame migrants for their own death and to normalize these forms of violence as natural, as necessary, and as inevitable. So in a way, although this has been happening for years, another elements of the past year of 2020 is that one of the key features, particularly of summer 2020, has been the mobilization around Black Lives Matter, the protest against police violence towards Black people, which led to the demands to abolish the police in an understanding and an analysis of racist violence of the police, not as an unintended outcome of policing, but as a structural feature of the police. And unfortunately, as activists against borders, as researchers against borders, we've been in a way disappointed by the way in which this silencing and this invisibilization had an effect in preventing similar contestations and similar uprisings against the regular and continuous murder and violence of border police and of bordering institutions against Black and migrant people and people on the move, as well as little demands to abolish borders as a violent institution, rather than just little attempts to denouncing its violence, which is, however, intrinsic to bordering institutions. So I would just like to conclude by saying that, repeating that it is important to indeed acknowledge that these practices of expulsion, of pushback, of letting people die, of confinement in quarantine ships are not exceptional, but are part of a continuity of border violence. They reached a point of extreme realization in a way with a complete withdrawal of rescue attempts of rescue interventions by the state and confinement of migrants on offshore detention. And we have to be careful that this escalation is then not kept in place in the future. So if we have to think about the next steps of mobilization, is really to make sure that although these are part of a continuity, we don't continue further, but we try to abolish not only borders, but also all the institutions that come with the bordering regime. I think I'm above my 10 minutes and I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because I was going to message you, but Deanna, you timed your presentation so perfectly. And the message is extremely sharp too. So now we have the second paper. I don't know who is, I will leave it to two of you to coordinate who will speak first or how you divide the presentation. The total time, I'm afraid, is same, is between 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah. Ankit and Aishwarya.
Yeah, we'll try to be within time. I mean, we'll try our level best. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for this. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear both of you. Yes. Is that Ankit that will go ahead? Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's Aishwarya again. Aishwarya, you can be now. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm really sorry. It's something with my connection. Thank you, Professor, so much for being so kind with the introduction, and thank you so much, team, because we had a really difficult time coordinating, and yes, the whole COVID thing, but we are glad that we're here, and we have to start with thanking, of course, the entire team, Rooted, for giving us the opportunity to share our research, and the Global Labor Research Center at York, because this huge encouragement while we had begun our research as well from the entire team there. This is a completely independent research, and one of the reasons that we had to take this up is because of the lack of data on migrant laborers. So when we started, this research was not planned as something which would emerge as a research paper. It really began with the questions that what's happening with, it began with the question, we were looking for data basically as to if people are moving from one state to the other within the country and amidst the pandemic, then how is that movement being facilitated? What kind of aid, what sort of rights, and what provisions in general do they have at their disposal? And one of the problems that we came, one of the main concerns that came up during the research was that there was hardly any data, and even the Right to Information Act that we have, even when activists tried to question the government on this and wanted to look at what the government had in their mapping, we only figured that there was hardly any concern at all from the policymakers' end. So, well, that's how this project began. It's we've done the research and repetition method, which would mean that it starts. We start looking at. We begin with April 2020, and we carry it on till January 2021. However, before Ankit begins, I must mention that even though the research period is till January 2021, because we were finishing up this paper, and also we were doing our research summary, and we knew that we had to present for the conference also. So we've added certain sections to it after January 2021, which is mostly at the policy end of it. So the policy brief comes there. Till then, it's repetition method for our survey, and we wanted to explore if an auto-ethnographical method was possible, but it was not. So we've put some open-ended interview questions, which we were lucky enough to be able to speak to a lot of the migrant laborers who were traveling from New Delhi, the capital city, to the states that they were from, and in this case, mostly Bihar, another northern Indian state. And all of that is a part of our survey as well, where we look at the political trust index. Now, well, that would be a brief summary, and I'm going to hand it over to Ankit now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aishwarya, and thank you, Oxford, for this opportunity. It's really a good distraction for all of us back here in India. So the title for our paper is Criminalizing Interstate Migration, COVID-19 and the Indian Informal Sector. The attempt in our paper is to understand that how lockdown, which was implemented as a response to pandemic, affected the life of the migrant worker. There are many aspects of workers' life which are affected by the government policies, and especially so under neoliberal directive. For the purpose of the paper, we will look into one of those aspects, that is mobility. Our research attempted to understand how Indian state during pandemic times placed citizen against citizen, privileged some, in the meanwhile ordained a second-hand treatment to massive section who was employed in the informal sector. The idea was to map how political system, which otherwise project itself as a messiah of the poor, maintained social distancing as opposed to physical distancing, both morally and through policies and programs, letting its citizens toil primarily with hunger, unemployment, helplessness, and finally with the disease. But before we go into detail of the precarity faced by the migrant laborer, we would like to quickly share how the migrant laboring community became such an essential part of Indian demography. The numerical growth of the migrant laboring community is simultaneous with the rapid expansion of the informal sector. Scholars like Barbara Harris-White, Kalyan Sanyal, Arjun Sen Gupta, Jan Bremen, and several others have already theoretically established this. Our paper builds on those theorizations in explaining how the government, civil society, and the village community become a stakeholder in determining the intensity of social criminalization faced by the migrant laborer. To understand this, we will have to agree that the migration from village to urban center is not merely a matter of choice for this huge population living in rural India. It is a search for it is not a search for better standard of living, but a battle for sustenance. There is a rural push that operates aided by the declining agrarian sector. The blocked opportunities in the rural economy make it mandatory for the worker to migrate to the urban center. Now, this remains the larger cause for migration in India. And once lockdown was imposed by the Prime Minister without any prior notice, the life world of those workers completely changed. And I would like to read that section, that how it impacted the life world of the worker once the lockdown was imposed. As said earlier, it was not something that was prior notified. It was an overnight process which happened. So generally one can say the lockdown was imposed from above without any prior notice or without any information to the people. These socioeconomic disadvantages and vulnerabilities worsened during the pandemic when sudden lockdown was announced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The lockdown in India was introduced by the Prime Minister as a penicillian moment to heal the harm done by the virus, just as he used demonetization to cure the ill health of Indian economy. Unfortunately, both the programmatic adventurism of the leader turned out to be the nightmare for the entire migrant worker, if not for the middle or elite class engaged in informal sector. While the informal sector was still struggling to come out of the burden of demonetization, a program which again it was introduced overnight by the Prime Minister, where he banned all 500 and 1,000 rupees note. So that was a demonetization policy which Narendra Modi government has brought. So the lockdown caught for the informal, and while the informal sector was still struggling to come out of the burden of demonetization, the lockdown caught for the informal sector as a whole and the workers engaged in it by surprise, shoving them toward the psychological and material misadventure. Overnight, workers engaged in daily wage earnings such as vending, street hawking, sanitation, construction, and so on and so forth, realized that they have no place to work. The source of their sustenance in the urban, peri-urban areas were gone. This built environment where they negotiated their lives and the lives of their family member was blocked along with other avenues of engagement. This abandoned workforce was left with no choice but to re-strategize towards survival. They waited, albatross did not arrive. The leader addressed the nation time and again, asked people to perform ritualistic banging of stainless steel dishes, arrange for lightning clay lamp, and basically most of such colonially imagined oriental symbols were taken as a battle sign to scare away the virus, rationalized by the majorities, faithful hailing of Prime Minister speeches, barely making any provision or announcement toward the more vulnerable section who largely form the workforce driving the informal sector, the intergenerational homeless, migrant worker, rough sleeper, and so on. Responding to the question on what was expected of the Prime Minister every time he appeared in the media during the first phase of lockdown, Rajesh from a Singh district of Bihar, one of the larger northern state in the subcontinent, said, "We stuck to television when we could and other times to the phone screen. Each time when Modi addressed the nation, he talked about several issues, how to stay safe indoors, follow the COVID protocol, but nothing about us who had no luxury to follow through any of this. We were left with no means to survive. And here was the leader whom we all supported since 2014, rendering us oblivious." After Modi's second address to the nation, Rajesh decided to leave for his hometown on his own. On being asked what propelled him to take such a decision to walk with his family and friends for more than 1,000 kilometers without any means of transportation, flouting with center and state rules, Rajesh reminisced the absence of money to survive in the capital city of New Delhi. He borrowed from his friend and relative as much as he could, but finally a stage came when he realized that there was no one left to help him. Even his friends were experiencing similar spatial precarity. Everyday survival was becoming a challenging task for Rajesh and his friend. Another contract worker at a nearby Basant Kunj mall who shares the shanty rented accommodation with Rajesh. Rajesh said, "While making bare arrangement for lunch at noon, we fret over possibilities for dinner. There was no hope left as their employees turned them away on loan or aid request." Sunita, who was domiciled from Katihar, said she struggled with the decision to take on journey on her own with 4-year-old to be responsible for. As mother who lived in the city as a migrant domestic worker, she neither had savings to continue with the urban expenses, nor could her employer to allow her to continue working as the employer family had children too, as she recollects. It felt irresponsible to ask them to allow outsider indoors amidst the pandemic. Much of the frustration was directed toward the political representative. On being asked what they expected from the political leaders, most of the respondents agreed with Moinuddin. Politics serves only the rich. We barely figure for them. It is only during the time of election that they would take us into account, seek our support. But some of us are not even voter here. Most of us have voter ID issued at the address of our village. Neither the local MLA nor did the MP, Member of Parliament, bothered to visit us. Politicians don't care for us. We are like insects who mourn for the mosquito. And these were the words that he used. So this whole aspect of pandemic, they were forced to leave from their initial places. And when they went back, at the time when they were leaving the place, there was a prominent discourse that this government came up with against the Muslim. I mean, this government is a populist government which is based on, whose politics is based on dividing the society on the line of us versus them. And here Muslims are the target. I mean, they started the discourse of Corona jihad, whereby Muslims were targeted that they are Corona mongers and spreading the disease in the community. I mean, this became the basis for, the further segregation of these migrant workers who were returning back to their villages with no hope left in these cities. Once they were on their way, they were not allowed to travel on the road. So they took the railway track, went thousands and thousands of kilometers. They traveled near about 1,600 kilometers on barefoot, without food, without water. I mean, on foot in 45 degrees Celsius, they were traveling. And once they reached their village, that became again, and that is why we titled this paper as Criminalizing Interstate Migration. Once they reached village, they were forced to stay in the quarantine center, where even basic facilities like toilets, we have shared that the paper where we have maintained that, where we have dealt with those accounts, where even the basic facilities. So where the basic facilities were being denied to them. And there are reports that several of these people, once they fled from those quarantine centers, their own villagers, they rise up in arms, they took up the batons against them and forced them out of the village. So they were neither allowed to go inside the village. So they made their makeshift quarantine center outside the village where their family member came with some food and stayed there. So this is how the government, dealt with this entire scenario of lockdown, whereby this migration became a criminal act. And that too for those people who were moving back to their home for their survival. So that led to a massive decline in the political trust, and that we have shared in our paper as well, how it has led to the decline in the political trust among those migrant workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I know that there is a very emotional situation, so I understand that you have much more to say. I'm sorry, I have to stop you. Just for the time being, we can come back to more discussion. And now finally, Juan, are you ready? Yeah, please go ahead. You are muted. We can't hear you. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. I have entitled my presentation, "The Social Exclusion of Venezuelan Migrants in Colombia During the COVID-19 Pandemic." The Venezuelan migration phenomenon is complex, have been considered as the second largest forced displacement crisis globally and the largest ever in Latin America. More than 5.6 million of Venezuelans have left their country. More than 1.7 million are in Colombia, but only 720,000 with regular status. With the coronavirus crisis, the social situation has been deteriorated, especially for irregular migrants. In this coronavirus framework, migrants live in conditions of poverty and extreme poverty. The exclusion have impact on migrants who are in this irregular situation. For the Colombian authorities, an irregular migrant is someone who has entered through unauthorized pathways known as trochas, or who has stayed for a longer period than authorized, and thus remains in a irregular situation. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency and the International Organization for Migration, more than half of the Venezuelan population in Colombia lack regular status, affecting their ability to access essential services, protection, and assistance. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the governments are taking a wide range of measures. In the case of Colombia, the country that hosts the major part of Venezuelan migrants, these responses have been characterized by contradictions between the political discourse and the social reality, contradictions between what is in the text in the legal framework and the social reality. I will present two concrete examples in the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic that illustrates these contradictions. First example, solidarity and stigmatization. Last year, the Colombian government, in exercise of its extraordinary powers, issued Decree 457 of March 22, through which it ordered the mandatory preventive isolation for all the inhabitants of the Colombian territory. Just 3 days after the state of emergency over the pandemic had been declared by Colombian authorities, the Colombian president expressed that the care of the migrant population in Colombia is perhaps their greatest challenge in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. However, in the same official statement, President Iván Duque reiterated that Colombia is in solidarity with the Venezuelan brothers who have taking refuge from the crisis in the neighboring country, but warned that we will not have tolerance for bad behavior here, and that whoever is committing crimes will be immediately deported. As a matter of fact, although the Colombian president press release discusses diverse subjects, the same headline heavily focused on deportation and clearly invoked a warning, expressing the solidarity but focused on the warning. The background of the previous official statement is not a message of solidarity, it's a message of warning, populism, and migration. Another example that needs to be taken into consideration in the context of COVID-19 vaccination is how on February of this year was presented the denominated Estatuto Temporal de Protección para Migrantes Venezolanos in Spanish and Temporary Protection Statute for Venezuelan Migrants in English. The Colombian government made a joint announcement with United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi, even Grandi expressed. Today, Colombia gave an extraordinary example to the region and the world by granting temporary protection status for 10 years to all Venezuelans on its territory. In this aspect, we can summarize this statute was internationally wide welcome. This temporary protection statute is constitute a political agenda of the Colombian government in the international scenario. But what have been the institutional Colombian context just few weeks ago of the previous announcement? In a local radio station, the same Colombian president stated, undocumented Venezuelan migrants won't be vaccinated. Literally, the Colombian president expressed. Those who don't have Colombian nationality and whose migration situation has not been regularized, of course, they won't be vaccinated. And add literally, the prioritization will always be the Colombian citizens. That will be our priority because that is how it is marked. In other words, the same government that presented internationally a legal plan to protect migrants denied vaccines to more than 55% of the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, nearly 1 million, because of their migratory status. There is no doubt that this decision represents social discrimination based on legal status and is an exclusionary policy and practice toward the most affected and the most vulnerable. Maybe this is one of the most significant examples of what is exclusion in the framework of the COVID-19 pandemic around the world. The previous example represents a distortion between the international discourse and the reality in situ. It's the construction of a reality at international scenario that protects human rights, but really is quite different. In order to understand the high level of politicization, we can see the response of the Venezuelan opposition of Juan Guaidó. The Venezuelan ambassador to Colombia, Tomás Guanipa, avoided criticizing the measure and came out in defense of Colombian president. In one message of Twitter of Guanipa on December 22 of 2020, expressed at the beginning of the message the following. During the COVID-19 emergency, the president, Iván Duque, delivered more than 200,000 markets of food to support migrants. We can infer of the previous declaration how argue that deliver 200,000 markets of food to support migrants to defend the decision of the exclusion of 1 million migrants of vaccination constitute a clear example of politicization. Another aspect that demonstrates the contradictory behavior of the Colombian government is the criminality. We can see how simultaneously the military confrontation has continued with ongoing forced displacement in both countries, as well as heightened criminal activity at the border. In Colombia, the fighting between armed groups displaced over 11,000 people only in the first 2 months of 2021. Arrest 7 people every hour, and criminal groups continue to grow. According to research conducted by the Fundación Paz y Reconciliación in Spanish, Peace and Reconciliation Foundation in English, of the Colombian border, there are 28 illegal armed structures present, among which are the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, National Liberation Army. There are 13 other organized armed groups, including Ejército Popular de Liberación, Popular Liberation Army, Los Rastrojos, and the Gulf Clan, and test for far armed groups, and 14 criminal organizations such as Los Pranes and the Sinaloa cartel. This creates a complex scenario with public servants in both countries tolerating and even forming alliances with these illegal armed structures, further demonstrated the contradictory behavior of the Colombian government. Conclusions. We can conclude the following. Over recent years, the situation of Venezuelan migrants in Colombia has been deteriorating, and Colombia has responded to this economic and social crisis in peculiar ways. Through COVID-19 pandemic, the responses have been contradictory at the international and national levels. Colombia official discourse at the international level seems to comply with the human rights obligation, but at the national level, the governing party, Centro Democrático, stigmatizes migrants and refugees from Venezuela and frames them as threats for national security and public health. Moreover, Colombia's exclusionist practices have become more obviously during COVID-19 crisis. The political framework in the current pandemic, in theory, puts social protection forward, but in practice, it offers social exclusion, as more than half of the Venezuelan migrant population in Colombia live in poverty and marginalization. The Colombian government is seeking to improve its image in the international scenario without acting to mitigate the effects of the pandemic on vulnerable migrants in a context of increasing xenophobia and social exclusion. In sum, the response of the Colombian government has been focused on trying to get political benefits along with social exclusion and lack of protection of human rights for the Venezuelan migrants. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Juan, for the very well prepared presentation. And now there's just a question coming in for you. Should I just read out and then you can answer? Did you consider the historical migration between Colombia and Venezuela? By the end of 2017, there were around 3 to 4 million Colombian migrants in Venezuela who, as the crisis worsened in Venezuela, started to return to Colombia. Their return has been very difficult. That issue has not been discussed or analyzed. Do you have anything to say about the returning migrants from Colombia back to Venezuela?
Yes, it's interesting because what's going on? The people from Venezuela that arrive to Colombia live in extreme poverty. For instance, I can highlight a thing that I have never seen in my whole life. From last year, we can hear the screams of the people, especially from Venezuela, asking some food. The scream, people asking, screaming, please, please, I'm hungry, my family, my children. And more or less the statistics, 200,000 have returned. But what happened in situ? That the people say how they go to Venezuela, return, go and return. So what will be the future of that situation? With the statute temporary protection, will have regularized, but the social situation, the economic situation is really complicated. And in my opinion, the numbers of migrants from Venezuela will return to Venezuela.
Thank you. And then another question for you again, Juan. Do you see a link between the exclusion of Venezuelan migrants from vaccines in Colombia, on one hand, and the non-recognition of Venezuelan as refugees under the Cartagena Declaration in many countries, including in Colombia? Whether or not the denial of their refugee status contributed to the fact that they are being excluded. You're muted.
Okay, with that subject happened something interesting. Colombia is the host, the major part of this exodus, okay? 1.7 million. But what happened with the refugee status, with asylum claims? Weeks ago, only 1.1% of asylum claimants of all the population Venezuela around the world is in Colombia. Now this number hiked a little, is in 1.8, the asylum claims. But what happened with that? Why this number is so slow in comparison with another country? We are talking about of almost 2 million of people and only 1.8 of asylum claims. And this number decreased even more. Why? Because not only the asylum claims is accepted by the Ministry of Colombia. I'm not sure in this moment, I'm not sure, I can remember the exact number in this moment, but in my opinion, even the number of refugee status from Venezuelan population in Colombia is nearly 1,000. It's a slow number.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so then another next question, some more question come to all the chat room instead of the Q&A. Okay. Another question is for Ankit and Aishwarya. We have seen interstate migrant workers criminalized twice when leaving the cities to their hometowns. How were they journeys back to the cities in between? Can you read that? Oh, somehow this is sent to me. Yeah, I'm not very sure about the question. We have seen interstate migrant workers being criminalized twice when leaving cities to their hometowns, possibly mean leaving and returning. How were the journeys back to the cities in between? Probably you just talk about journey itself, probably, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for the question. Please correct me if I did not get the question right, but as of now, as I understand, if the question is about first they migrate to the urban centers looking for work, and then amidst the pandemic, they go back, because obviously there's a loss, there's a spatial precarity which is rising, and there's a loss of the built environment, and there's a difficulty staying in the urban centers, so they're going back. But then as the pandemic, as the lockdown, the restrictions go away, they travel back seeking work. Is it that? Okay. So this actually did happen. So this is exactly where I mentioned that we've tried the reputation method for our surveys, for our open-ended surveys, because we only did our research till January 2021. What started happening was December onwards, the migrant laboring community started coming back to these cities, thinking that, okay, a part of, just assuming that with the pandemic, with the restrictions releasing, there would probably be a little bit, some sort of economic opportunities would come up. There is a documentation, and as we're also preparing a larger draft for GLRC right now, while we're presenting a more detailed research, where we are discussing that these migrant laboring communities did assume that even though the economy would not be as sufficient as it was earlier before the pandemic, but there would still be some job opportunities which would come up. And because the rural push is so harsh, because obviously the agrarian sector in India right now has, over the last 5-6 years, has been suffering greatly, and there are not many opportunities back home for these people. So as they travel back, even with very little promises of work, they still want to make that journey back. Making that journey is difficult because now they already don't have enough money to sustain in the cities unless they get a job. They also have to pay for the journey, but they still do this. What happens is by the end of February, the second wave hits India, and by late March, another set of lockdowns begin. Now, this time, they do not want to wait for larger restrictions to come up, because they've already seen how difficult it is to go back home once in between the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic. So now the exodus starts right at the very beginning. The moment the news comes up that there's going to be a spike's already hitting India, they are they book tickets, they go back as soon as they can. This time, so it's no longer by roadways, or now they're not walking back anymore. So obviously, if you're looking at whether they violate the Disaster Management Act 2005 in returning back home, and in violating state borders, because borders closed up within the country, interstate borders had closed up. So earlier they would be violating these legal restrictions. This time they do not have to do that, because they're not waiting till lockdowns to hit. The moment the news comes up that the cases are spiraling up, and there's a chance of a lockdown, they immediately take to the bus terminals, and they want to go back. It is difficult. So here, a moral responsibility of the state probably comes in, and there's much debate over this. So I'm totally expecting more questions on this. Whether the state should be providing for these people, because India depends on its informal sector like any peripheral economy would, and these are the working hands for that sector. So for them to come back seeking work, and for them to go back again without getting enough money, without being able to earn enough money in between to sustain themselves, or even the journeys per se, yes, those concerns are there. But it is better this time, and I'm just using the word better for the lack of any other word, because this time they are not going to be legally criminals. Socially, the poor is always a social criminal, because you always see them in terms of the people who are going to be spreading the virus, in terms of the people who are going to be the biggest threat to your communities. Even if, whether you're the urban elite, whether you're in the village community, either way, it's always going to be, the onus will be theirs. And the state till now has not taken up that responsibility. So yes, so that I'm not sure, but if I got the question correct.
But the answer is very informative and valuable. So I just read the questions in the order that come in the chat room. And again, so the next question is to Juan. And how are Venezuelan migrants situated within the current climate of protests in Colombia? You are muted, Juan.
Yeah. How is the question, Professor?
Not from me, it is, I'm reading from.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, did you hear me? No, the question was, what's the situation among migrants given the current climate of protests in Colombia? The political contestation in Colombia, yeah. How do you situate the migrants there? Yeah.
Okay. In stricto sensu, in this moment with the protests that have been almost 2 weeks, the subject, the theme of the Venezuelan migrants in the protests have been abroad, even for the same official media from the main media in Colombia that are linked with the institutionality, with the government. But we can remember, we need to remember that in general, previous of these protests in 2019, before of the COVID-19, there was a big protest in Colombia too, with the social situation that is starting to see the poverty, to have conscious of the young of the poverty. There is official discourse of criminalization with Venezuelans in illegal activity and in the protests to have to manifestate. But in a stricto sensu, in this moment, with the protests that have been 2 weeks ago, this subject haven't been approached.
So this muting, unmuting is always a slightly tricky. And then the question for Ankit and Aishwarya about the methodology, I think it's from Sarah. I would be interested in hearing more about your research methodology and the access to migrant workers as they travel back. Yeah, and also maybe you could briefly discuss the policy recommendations that based on your research. I suppose Aishwarya did mention probably no lockdown is better than lockdown compared to this year and last year. Yeah. Anyway, so methodology and any policy recommendations.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for the questions as well. Initially, so this is where we'll just come up honest. Initially, we wanted to go for some sort of an improvised version of auto ethnography. We wanted to document what the migrant workers or their communities as a whole wanted to share about their distress. But the problem is that the number is huge. Delhi as a city has 1.7 million migrant workers, and they're all employed in the informal sector. So we're not even looking at the formal service sector here. So to have a sizable section of people who would be sharing their stories with us, we would not know how to document it. So we had to go for an open-ended questionnaire instead. And we tried to do a repetition method because, so this is how the methodology is related to the rationale that we were that guided our research. We wanted to create a policy recommendation as to how can, I mean, not a flawless one, but at least something for the government and the other stakeholders to have a look at. How can the situation be bettered? To do that, we had to map the entire time period. One is when they are going back for the first time, then when they're coming back, and when they're coming back, what are the expectations that they have? So that is why we went for a repetition method. April, and then 3 months later, and 3 months later till January 2021, from April 2020. We wanted to map the changes in the political attitudes, as well as in the awareness, in the policy awareness amongst the migrant laboring communities. One of the key things that came up is during April, from April till August, the first section, most of the migrant laborers were unaware of any policies that the government had. So there's one thing that the government did not have any targeted policy. to aid their return or to make things easier for them, or direct benefits, let's say cash benefit or benefit in kinds to help them stay where they are. Like, for now, just be wherever you are, do not move. Let's take care of the disease first. Neither was that attitude available, nor was there some sort of a help for them to go back home safely. It was only after 19 people and then plus 10 people died. I do not want to use the word killed. So they lost their lives on the railway tracks because they just fell asleep. They were following the railway tracks to go back home because you cannot take the roadways to go back home. The roadways would be sealed off due to the pandemic. And this is under the Disaster Management Act, which would mean that the states are no longer responsible. It's completely under central control. Understanding that we are a quasi-federal country, the center often has the upper hand, especially in these kind of emergencies. And then there were deaths that were unaccounted for, and the numbers that I have with me are only numbers that were recorded, so which would, and not from government sources. The government actually does not have any number for this. So for the first quarter of our research period, most of the migrant workers just did not know what was going on, which state is closed, which state isn't, where they would meet the police, where they would not meet the police. And that was a lot of distress for them because they did not know what is the easiest way to go back home. Some of them just travel 1,500 kilometers. They walked because they thought that is the easiest way, because none of the means of transport were sealed off and there were no special trains running. Then the government introduced special trains, but the problem is most of it works on paper, and even the ones that actually ferry, there were around 90 people on board who lost lives. No one knows how, no one knows what disease they contracted. No one knows how these 90 people, whether they lost their lives because of some sort of an accident. Was it physical duress? Would it be COVID? Would it be some other kind of disease? So in the presence of the lack of so much data, we went for a one-on-one survey method so that we could just get the testimonies in the easiest way possible, because there was no way to go for a primary archive. There was no archive. We had to build our own archive if anybody would have to build their own archives. There were activists, civil society activists, but one has to understand that a lot of times civil society activists also make work very easy for the government, because the government in India, what the attitude was that it's a pandemic. So, there's only so much we can do. The situation is so bad. So why don't you help each other? And which is wonderful. And we want to help everybody. I mean, that's what humanity would tell you, but that cannot be the government shunning the entire responsibility away. And that's exactly what happened. So when the civil society activists came in, and this came out of our surveys as well, part of the food, part of the transport facilities were facilitated. They paid for it and so on and so forth, but it was not a continuous effort. And because this was charity, you cannot hold anyone responsible. We did, because it was also, we had our own limitations. We were already present in the city, and we were in some ways biased. So we tried to triangulate our data, and with the ethnographic means, we also brought in the surveys. But that aside, we also added to it the existing data from some think tanks and of course from the government as well. What we found out is that there's a huge difference between what the migrant laborers were saying about their own distress, what the government thought of it, and of course, the think tanks were somewhere in between. It was a balanced act. It was only by May, June, July, and later that the government started discussing a $1.7 trillion package to help the migrant laborers. Up till January 2021, actually now I can say up till May 2021, this 1.7 trillion package does not exist anywhere if you see in terms of implementation. So again, to go back to the methodology, we tried to see if maybe some of the benefits have been transferred. Some of the migrant workers did get some benefits out of the package that the government announced. but none of that happened. There were also alternative employment opportunities that were being discussed, which is, again, these are available with the government websites for anyone to check. But when you go back and triangulate the data that we received from our interviews and from the survey, the migrant workers did not get any benefits. So who was getting the benefit of this $1.7 trillion? Big question, and we don't have the answer to it even after the research. These have been the limitations actually of the research, because we did not know whom else to ask, and it's not open to RTI. There is no way that we can the right to information. There's no way we can ask the government about it, because the government is like, we're still under a pandemic, so stop asking us questions. Another. Yes. Sorry. So I'll take 30 seconds on the policy recommendation thing. We tried to look at the ILO's. The ILO came up with a report that's tried to map the Global South's intervention in treating its migrant workers better. And we tried to see if that is feasible for India. Parts of it are, for instance, direct cash benefits, free ration or food, to ensure that there are policy recommendations which are implemented at the housing level. So if the rent can be, if for a certain time period, there can be rentless living, and if the government can facilitate these things. So these are some of the policy recommendations that we were trying to put forth, keeping in mind the Global South and of course a fragile economy that we're already in. So we're not expecting a Global North treatment. But however, understanding the government's own attitude towards this, it still comes down to this, that, hey, it's a pandemic. Some people's got to go. It's like that. Sad that it is. And we're quite ashamed of it, to be honest.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Now a question for Deanna. Actually, probably it's also a basket of questions. Does COVID excuse criminalize not only migrants, but also criminalize or at least stigmatize solidarity movement? So I'm also very curious to know, your research partners, there's a wonderful co-research project, right? You work with activists. In this difficult time, I assume activists face more pressure. You how to explain to your neighbors and friends, why do you help migrants? And is that true? They face more pressure, and what is their strategy in interacting with fellow citizens in explaining this situation? And finally, do you think the COVID excuse, though itself is tied to the specific incident of the pandemic, would that have long-lasting impacts in terms of border control and border violence?
Thank you for all these questions. Just to put a little bit of context, the criminalization of activism and of solidarity at sea has been happening for years. So this is part of a continuum that I've been talking about. Rescue ships that have in the past refused to cooperate with authorities, that have refused to let authorities on board, and that have refused to cooperate with the criminalization of migrants, have been accused of facilitating illegal immigration. They've been accused of colluding with smugglers, which obviously they're all lies, but this have been like the political climate created around those forms of civil society activism that intervene at sea and that refuse to let people die. However, I wouldn't say that the COVID pandemic has increased the criminalization of these forms of activism, but rather it has increased the administrative measures to prevent activism at sea, to prevent intervention at sea. So for instance, all the rescue ships that would normally operate in the central Mediterranean Sea to fill the rescue gap left by the states. During the first months of the pandemic, they were not able to go on a rescue mission because of COVID restrictions, of COVID-related restrictions. And when they went on missions, they also had a limit on how many people they could rescue. So if normally a rescue ship can rescue up to 500 people, because of COVID restrictions, they could only rescue maybe 150 people. And then if they go above the limit, then they are in violation of health and safety regulations, and then they get fined or they get stranded in the harbor for further checks. So this is not a criminalization technique. There is no use of criminal law, but there are administrative measures that hinders and put obstacles to the work of activists and of civil society organizations that counter the logic of the state. Your second question on the long-lasting impact, of course, it is going to be a long-lasting impact, because obviously the pandemic, as I said in the presentation, is being used as an excuse to accelerate certain measures and to let them happen in complete silence. So, for instance, the idea of quarantine, of offshore detention that is now materialized in quarantine ships has been there as an idea since 2016, 2017, but it could never materialize because there was political opposition to that. But during COVID, it just happened without a discussion around it. It just passed without, it was a sort of an emergency measure, but obviously we know how these things go, and we know that this will be kept post-COVID.
That's a wonderful. Then actually there's more question kind of follow from that. I mean, what you described is really a classical example of so-called shock therapy, right? Is by Naomi Klein. When you have a shock, like things like a pandemic, the public attention is diverted to something else, and there's no public debate. In your language, is invisibilize the entire issue, and so therefore lots of legislations can be passed in haste with minimum public scrutiny. And I think the point you mentioned, very interesting. I mean, here today we talk about lots of criminalization. Sometimes we need to be careful what it means because it's a very technically legal term. But you said, it's not criminalizing solidarity movement, but it's creating all kinds of administrative obstacles. It's kind of depoliticize the issue, actually make it more difficult. If you criminalize, actually you can, have either legal battle or political battle. But it's come down with all kind of complicated administrative regulation, sometimes under the name of safety. It is very difficult to fight back. I think that's a wonderful, very nuanced observation. And therefore, the following question I think is interesting is how do we re-politicize this, the matter, the movement? And the question is as follows. Could you please expand a bit more on the lack of mobilization around the migrants' lives being systematically murdered, as opposed to the Black Lives Matter movement? What do you think it would take to catalyze public response around border violence, as opposed to make border violence as a subject matter for mobilization? Does the highly spectralized representation of sea border crossing work for or against the visibility of border violence? I mean, that is also a very interesting question. The sea border crossing now became such a huge spectacle. Actually, it is a way to increase the visibility, or actually it's in a way decrease the political nature of the whole issues. Yeah, I mean, again, a basket, probably you can just highlight the most important response to these questions.
Yeah, thank you. There is a lot indeed, and they're all very important points that we actually highlight in the actual paper. What you're saying about the depoliticizing of this repression when it becomes administrative is very important, because then you find yourself fighting very little technical battles, and it's very difficult to say this is a form of political repression. And in a way, when in Italy there was a far right at the government, and Salvini was criminalizing, using a discourse that was criminalizing and stigmatizing rescue at sea. In a way, it was easier to fight back because the discourse was very explicit and it was very oppositional, while now there is a sort of very subtle way of repressing, which is much more difficult to fight back. How to bring politics back? Well, for me, it's really about always trying to show, and that's, I think, also part of the activist work and the documentation work that also people on the move do, is to clearly show their responsibilities and to really show that what is happening at sea is not inevitable, but is a choice that is done every day. But when people die, it's not because it was a very unfortunate tragedy, but it is because they were left to die. And with Alarm Phone and as well as other civil society organizations, the point is really to show how our authorities misbehave. And there was a shipwreck less than a month ago where 130 people died, and that it was really clear that the people were left to die 3 times. And I think in this case, for instance, it was there was a sort of mobilization in Italy and a sort of understanding that what happened was a political decision and it was not just a tragedy. So I think that doing this work of documentation, of creating accountability, of really like reconstructing how things happen, has an effect. In terms of visibility, is very difficult, because obviously you don't want things to become politicized only when you see bodies, dead bodies at sea. You want to politicize, at least I would like to politicize issues by showing life, by showing resistance, by showing the powerful actions of people on the move. But unfortunately, it looks that more and more people mobilize only after, only when it's too late, only when people are dead, when they see a dead body washed ashore. And then for me, that's too late, and is also politically wrong to only get outraged when we see and intervene and do something when we see that people are already dead.
Thank you. I think we are towards the end of the panel, and there are more questions in the chat rooms and also the Q&A box. I hope you can have access to them even after this panel ends. But there is a last question. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the question now is coming, which I referred to in the question to Deanna, is from, I think, Sylvia. Is it Sylvia? Yeah. And then I have one question from Miao Ling. It's a general question, a great one again. To all of you, I suppose I will ask the question and I invite all the panelists to respond. And Miao Ling asked 2 questions, but sorry, Miao Ling, due to the limit of time, I will just pick up the second question. Is that how can we as researchers reframe all the issues like border violence and the criminalization of interstate mobility with powerful concepts, so that the results of our research might have immediate impacts on government actions? Do the strategies of shaming, naming, and persuasion still work in the current context? Basically, we have done enough with moral denunciation, shaming, and criticizing, but it seems that we live in a parallel world. The government and all the powerful actors carry on with what they are doing. So is there anything else we can do conceptually than reframe the issues, so therefore we can be more impactful, can change? And there's also another question they're asking whether or not the militarization of international border can be regarded as a violation of international law. This, if you have, that's related to that as well, how to make research more impactful. And can we invite each of the panelists to respond in the order of how they presented their paper? So start with you, Deanna.
again, very complex questions, and I didn't get the first one completely, but I think that the answer is yes. I think bringing naming, shaming, not just by naming and shaming, but pointing fingers and say, this actor is responsible, Frontex is violating international law. So in a way, the two questions go together, right? So it is very important to keep doing that, because otherwise we just end up in a vacuum of understanding of how this politics and this violence is produced every day and is done every day and is decided politically every day. So pointing at those who are responsible for these decisions, for me, is a way to go forward and to make them responsible for this violence and for these violations.
Great. Yeah. Ankit and Aishwarya, yeah. So how is there any way to make our research more impactful?
I think I'm going to make this really short, because I think Ankit will have something to say here and he will disagree completely with me. I do believe that if it's the kind of government that we are experiencing in India right now, there is no way telling this government, there's no naming and shaming that's going to work for them. See, I mean, let's just think of it in this way, that if one is here to stay in power, then one is here to stay in power, period. And for me, I think right now, if I'm looking at the migrant situation, then I want work done. I want benefits for them. And I want them right now at an immediate level. So I'm just going to be nice and cute to the government, and I'm going to ensure that there is more and more public awareness, because they're afraid of elections and elections alone, because that's how they lose power. So the more awareness would mean more people questioning the government and saying, if you do not give me those benefits, then I'm not going to give you a vote. So that's how I would go about it. And that's why I mean, my section of the paper would be the policy recommendations. Ankit would disagree. He'd be like, you've got to go out there on the streets and do something about it. So.
Yeah, I'll completely disagree with what she has to say on this question. I mean, I think if you can correlate this question of border violence with the migrant worker, one of the major issues which I think a country like India lacks is unionization. I mean, that might sound as an outdated idea, but I think informal sector in India completely lacks any form of union, and there is no one to take up the their voice. I mean, set apart this border and violence question, but also everyday violence that they experience at their workplaces, in getting their wages and all. I mean, the kind of violence that they are subjected to. There is complete, silence over these questions. So I think if we work toward mobilize, and the biggest challenge in this sector is mobilization. So you see, there are migrant workers coming from different part of the country. So how will you mobilize? I mean, David Harvey will suggest you by mobilizing through the neighborhood, but that also doesn't work, because in migration, when you will tap the migration in a country like India, there are a lot of intersectionalities, like class is one of them. I mean, class mixed with caste. So in India, caste is a big issue. So there are different difficulties of mobilization on the basis of caste. So you won't find a Brahmin worker having a solidarity with a Dalit worker, despite the fact that both are both are working as a security guards. So these are the larger challenges that we face. But yet, I mean, I don't see any other option except unionization, which can, bring them united and can compel the government. There I would like to agree with Aishwarya. I mean, compel the government, with much more force, backed by a force of ballot. So unless that doesn't happen, and these people are again the same people who are swayed away differently, because once the government, uses the trope of religion, these people gets divided in terms of Hindus and Muslim, Christians, and so on and so forth. So these are the same people on the basis of their caste. So these are the kind of, digressions one can notice in the working class. I mean, migrant worker per se. So one need to, strongly pitch this idea of mobilization, and that is something a big task. Left upon, as far as the left parties are concerned in India, I mean, they are completely routed out. They are rooted out of political scenario now. They no more exist. So this becomes again more difficult given the kind of neoliberal push that we have, and where everyone, I mean, small tokenism won't work, and there is no other political party which can do. So in that sense, I agree that transnational organization, can play a very significant role if they raises this question. But again, that it has its own limitation, because the kind of government which we are dealing with, they do not allow any kind of interference of international organization. You recently saw Greta Thunberg tweeted for farmers movement, and that became a big issue in India. And an environment activist, 19-year-old environment activist who retweeted the tweet of Greta Thunberg was arrested and put behind bar for more than 6 days, 7 days. So it's only after the protest she was released. But then this is how the government is responding even to a retweet. So that might become a quite difficult situation. I mean, it's a tough question.
Thank you very much, Ankit. Actually, you also answered one of the questions in the Q&A box is about the religion. You touched on that very pertinently. So Juan, you have the last words, and also you made a very important point. Colombian government actually possesses all the right languages, but of course the practice is different. So if we just simply repeat these languages, I mean, we can have nothing to achieve, because they know all these words and they're using the words. What should we do as researchers? Please unmute.
Once again. The point is that we can infer in general root the distortion, the diverse between the elaborated text, the juridical framework, the political discourse, but in practice, in situ, is really diverse. This is a general rule of the Colombian institutionality, of the Colombian government. I want to point out an example. If you take the constitution, the political constitution of Colombia, is a constitution of 1991 with almost 400 articles. This constitution have a lot of reforms, a lot of reforms, that a number of the article is the same number, I put B, the character B, to duplicate the meaning. So it's a distortion of the legal framework, of the political discourse. And I don't know what happened with that, because it's the norm, it's the day-to-day. For instance, the right to health, that this COVID-19, we can point out with irregular migrants and even with regular migrants. What happened with the right to health is a juridical framework in detail, perfect that. But in general route, to use the right to health, you need to go first to go to the doctor. You need to go first to the judge for a mechanism that is in Spanish, acción de tutela, to say, please, that hospital, that institution don't want guarantee my right to health. So the judge, in a process of 10 days, 15 days, okay, oblige to institution. So it's a general rule, the distortion, the reality in a text and the reality in situ.
That's very interesting. Again, let's go back to Diana's points as well. You have all this technical distortion of these quite a general principles. So therefore, sometimes I think if we still carry on with general principles, maybe we are in a losing battlefield, whether or not, probably that is Antik's point as well, more straightforward political mobilization, moving away from the liberal rights discourse, maybe it's more effective. But this is just a point for thought and the discussion. It's a wonderful evening. So we will have some final words from the committee. Who is that? Will be Sarah again? Oh, it's a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be me. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone for attending, for the panelists for preparing such timely presentations, and of course to Biao for moderating. Our last panel takes place tomorrow at 3 p.m. BST on current resistance and future alternatives by the brilliant Professor Naomi Pike, who she'll be chairing. And she gave a very fascinating talk during the Refugee Studies Center seminar series on abolitionist sanctuaries. So we're really excited to have her back. And then while resistance and future imagining has been interwoven throughout the week, we're really looking forward to the dedicated discussion. If you are enjoying the conference, please consider making a donation, which can be done through purchasing a donation ticket on our Eventbrite page. Your donations will be split among 5 organizations that are each contributing to the conference week: Otros Streams en Acción, Border Violence Monitoring Network, State Watch, Oxford Against Immigration Detention, and Art Connects. Thank you as well to the co-hosts, Routed Magazine, Border Criminologies, and the Oxford Migration Mobility Network. Do be sure to follow us along on social media for information on the rest of the conference week. And it's been so great to see all the connections happening online and conversations taking place there. So we really do hope you'll be virtually joining us tomorrow. And if you have not already had a look, the conference special issue is available on the Routed website. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and please take care. Thank you.